Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
My name's Eden. I'm 26, and I've learned the hard way that family pride can turn into poison if you let it. On paper, my extended family looks perfectly ordinary. Sunday dinners, birthday gatherings, the occasional wedding or graduation. But underneath that, there's always been this unspoken competition, especially between my Aunt Lillian's side of the family and mine. My parents and I have always been the quiet ones, the ones who don't brag, who just show up, bring a gift, and go home. Lillian, on the other hand, has built her entire identity around making sure everyone knows how well her family is doing. Her son, my cousin Nathan, is her trophy. Every time she talks about him, you'd think he was some kind of modern-day Einstein. He got good grades, went to a decent university, and apparently, according to her, has a brilliant mind for business. I've heard that phrase so many times it's practically burned into my memory. Nathan just has a brilliant mind for business. I used to nod along politely when she said it at family dinners, even when Nathan himself would smirk across the table and say something condescending like, "Don't worry, Eden, I'm sure you'll find your path eventually." He'd say it in that syrupy, fake nice tone people use when they want to sound humble while rubbing your face in something. For years, I let it slide. I told myself I didn't need to prove anything to them. I grew up pretty modestly. My parents never had a lot of money, but they always made sure I had what I needed. I wasn't spoiled like Nathan, who got a brand new car at 18 as a reward for his dedication. My parents couldn't afford things like that, so I worked part-time through college, paid off my own student loans, and started my own small marketing agency from scratch. It wasn't glamorous at first, just me in my apartment, designing campaigns for small local businesses, but over time, it grew. I hired people, got an office space, and slowly built a solid reputation. The best part? I didn't tell my extended family much about it. They didn't ask, and I didn't feel the need to share. I liked the peace that came with being underestimated. But that peace started to crack last year when Lillian found out through social media that my agency had been featured in a local business article. It wasn't anything huge, but apparently, it was enough to get her attention. The next time we saw each other, she said, "Oh, I saw that little article about your business. That's cute. You're really doing something with those online ads, right?" I smiled and said, "Yeah, something like that." Even though I wanted to correct her, it wasn't just online ads. We'd worked with corporate clients, national campaigns, the real deal. But Lillian didn't care about facts. She just wanted to make sure I knew she still saw me as the kid who doodled logos in her notebook. And then came Nathan's engagement party. Lillian had been planning it for months, and she made sure everyone knew how extravagant it would be. My mom told me it was being held at some high-end venue downtown, with a catering company that usually does events for politicians. When I got the invitation, I hesitated. I hadn't spoken to Nathan in almost a year, and the idea of being trapped in a room full of my aunt's smug compliments didn't exactly thrill me. But my mom insisted. "It's family, Eden. We can't just not go." So I went. The moment I stepped into that ballroom, I could feel the hierarchy. Everyone was dressed like they were attending a gala. Lillian was floating around in a glittery dress, hugging guests, making introductions, talking too loudly about Nathan's bright future. My cousin stood near the bar, flashing his rehearsed smile and shaking hands like a politician. His fiancée, Ava, was sweet and soft-spoken, honestly, too good for him. I could tell right away she wasn't comfortable with the over-the-top event. When my parents and I approached, Lillian's eyes lit up with that saccharine enthusiasm she reserves for people she's about to subtly insult. "Eden, you look lovely, dear. It's been so long. How's your little business going?" she asked, drawing out the word little just enough to sting. I smiled politely. "It's going really well, actually. We've expanded to a second office this year." Her expression flickered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, that's nice. Nathan's been looking into some management positions recently, haven't you, sweetheart?" She turned to him like a director feeding lines to her lead actor. Nathan smirked. "Yeah, I've been getting offers. Big companies, you know. But I'm taking my time. Don't want to settle for something small." The word small hung in the air between us, deliberate. My mom looked like she wanted to step in, but I gently squeezed her hand to let her know I was fine. I'd learned how to keep my cool around them. That night, though, it felt different. Their smugness didn't just irritate me, it made me curious. Because I happened to know something they didn't. A few weeks earlier, one of my HR managers had mentioned that a candidate named Nathan L. had applied for a mid-level position at our company. I didn't think much of it until I saw his resume. There it was, Nathan Lowell, my cousin. He'd applied 3 times for different roles, each time trying to angle his way in. The irony was almost poetic. The same cousin who once said my business was probably a hobby that'll fizzle out was now trying to work for me. I hadn't said a word to him or anyone else about it. I wanted to see how long he'd keep pretending. The engagement party was exactly what you'd expect. Overdone speeches, fake laughter, and a buffet that could feed an army. I spent most of the night standing near my parents or chatting with Ava, who seemed genuinely sweet but completely out of place. Nathan strutted around like he owned the place, telling people about his consulting work, which I knew from mutual acquaintances meant unemployed but keeping options open. Then came the moment that would change everything. We were all seated at our tables, and someone made a toast to Nathan and Ava. After a few sentimental words, Lillian stood up, glass in hand, glowing with pride. "You know," she said loudly, "watching my son succeed has been the greatest joy of my life. He's worked so hard and accomplished so much. Maybe one day, Eden," she added with a little chuckle, "you'll be as successful as him." The room erupted in polite laughter. Even some relatives who barely knew me smiled awkwardly, following Lillian's lead. My parents froze. I could see my mom's eyes dart to mine, silently begging me not to react. But I didn't need to. I just smiled, calmly, genuinely. Then I said, "That's funny, Aunt Lillian. He's been applying for a job at my company for weeks." The silence that followed was deafening. Nathan's fork clattered against his plate. Lillian's grin faltered. For a moment, no one said a word. All the laughter evaporated into an uncomfortable hush, broken only by the clinking of a waiter's tray in the background. My dad looked stunned, my mom's lips pressed tightly together, and Nathan's fiancée looked like she was trying not to choke on her drink. And me? I just kept smiling. That was the exact moment I realized the dynamic had finally shifted. For the first time, they couldn't pretend anymore. But that was only the beginning, because what happened after that night made everything far messier than I ever could have imagined. The morning after the engagement party, my phone started buzzing before I even got out of bed. I already had a gut feeling who it might be. When I saw Aunt Lillian flashing across the screen, I wasn't surprised, just mildly entertained. I stared at it for a few seconds before answering, letting her stew in the uncertainty. When I finally picked up, her tone was sugar-coated and sharp at the same time. "Eden," she said, drawing my name out like she was trying to stay calm. "I just wanted to clarify something about what you said last night. You must have misunderstood. Nathan didn't apply to your company. He was just exploring opportunities. Networking, you know? I don't think it's appropriate to make a scene like that, especially at someone's engagement party." I could practically hear the tightness in her voice, the mix of anger and embarrassment. "Funny," I replied casually, sitting up in bed, because our HR department forwarded me his resume 3 times. Same email, same phone number. Unless there's another Nathan Lowell who graduated from Ridgeway University and worked at a consulting firm that dissolved last year. There was a pause long enough that I thought she might hang up. Then came the inevitable shift, from fake calm to passive-aggressive defense. "Well, I think it's unprofessional to bring personal business into a family event," she said. "You embarrassed him in front of everyone. He's been under a lot of stress lately, and your little comment didn't help." I almost laughed. My little comment? After years of her backhanded remarks, her condescending jokes, and her endless bragging, suddenly I was the problem. "Right?" I said quietly, "because saying he's been applying for a job at my company is way out of line. My mistake." "You've changed, Eden," she snapped. "Success has clearly gone to your head. Nathan was always so supportive of you." That was when I couldn't hold back anymore. "Supportive?" I repeated, incredulous. Do you mean when he told me my business would probably collapse before I hit 25? Or when he laughed in front of everyone at Christmas because I couldn't afford to travel to Europe with you all? She didn't answer. Didn't think so? I added and hung up. I sat there for a minute afterward, letting the silence settle around me. There wasn't anger, not really, just this dull, exhausted feeling. The kind that comes from realizing you've spent years trying to earn respect from people who never intended to give it. But I should have known that wouldn't be the end of it. That afternoon, I went into the office to catch up on a few projects. My assistant, Tessa, greeted me with her usual cheerful tone, but there was something hesitant in her expression. "Hey, Eden, there's something weird you might want to see," she said, handing me her tablet. On the screen was an email forwarded from the HR department. The subject line read, "Regarding the position application, Nathan Lowell." Apparently, after the party, Nathan had written to HR personally, accusing them of mishandling his application and suggesting that the CEO, me, had violated professional boundaries by discussing it in a public setting. He'd actually tried to spin the situation to make himself look like the victim. I couldn't help but let out a low laugh. The audacity was almost impressive. I told HR to document everything and leave the matter to me. For now, I just wanted to focus on work and let things cool off. But the more I tried to move on, the more I realized how deep my aunt's influence ran. She'd already started calling relatives, twisting the story until I sounded like a villain. By the weekend, my mom called me, sounding tired and anxious. "Eden, honey, I've been getting calls from Lillian. She's saying you humiliated Nathan intentionally, that you've been," her words, "using your money to lord it over everyone." I groaned. Of course she is. What else did she say? My mom hesitated. She said maybe it's best if we skip next Sunday's family dinner, just until things calm down. That stung more than I expected. I wasn't close to my aunt, but I'd always gone to those dinners for my parents. It was our one stable family ritual. The idea that I had to skip it because of Lillian's gossip made my chest tighten. Still, I agreed. Yeah, maybe that's for the best. Over the next week, the rumors spread like wildfire. Apparently, I'd mocked Nathan's career, insulted him in front of his fiancée, and bragged about being rich. My parents tried to defend me, but Lillian's version of events had already sunk its claws into everyone's perception. Then one day, I got a call from Ava, the fiancée. "Hey, Eden," she said softly. "I just wanted to apologize for how things went that night. It was uncomfortable, to say the least." "It's fine," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You didn't do anything wrong." She hesitated. "I think Nathan's embarrassed. He didn't expect you to be doing so well. He's been really down about it." "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I can tell." "I shouldn't say this," she went on, "but Lillian's been talking nonstop about you. She keeps saying you owe the family an apology." I felt my jaw tighten. An apology? For what existing? Ava let out a nervous laugh. "Honestly, I don't know. I just thought you should know what's being said." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. All those years I'd quietly worked my way up. All the nights I stayed up managing deadlines, pushing through burnout, and wondering if I'd ever make it. And now, because I'd dared to succeed, they were treating me like I'd done something wrong. It wasn't about money or status for me. It was about self-respect. And for the first time, I realized how much they'd chipped away at mine over the years. The following Sunday, I went to visit my parents instead of attending the family dinner. My mom was relieved to see me, though I could tell she was torn between loyalty to me and the desire to keep the peace. My dad, on the other hand, was fuming. "You should have seen Lillian last night," he said. She went on and on about how Nathan's career prospects are better than ever, and how you could learn something from him about humility. My mom winced. Let's not make things worse. But I was done staying quiet. The next day, I decided to stop being passive about it. I reached out to my lawyer, not to sue anyone or anything dramatic, but to get advice about formal HR protocols. If Nathan was still applying under false pretenses, I wanted everything documented. And, sure enough, 2 days later, HR informed me that he'd submitted another application, this time under a slightly altered email address, probably hoping I wouldn't notice. I stared at the screen, shaking my head in disbelief. He actually thinks this will work. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I let it simmer. Let him keep digging. Meanwhile, Lillian escalated. She started calling my mom daily, asking for updates on me, saying things like, "I just worry about Eden. She's always been so sensitive." That was her favorite word. She'd used it my whole life to undermine me, to make every reaction sound like an overreaction. When she realized she couldn't get a rise out of me directly, she went for subtle sabotage. A client of mine, someone we'd recently signed through a family friend, called me out of the blue. "Eden," he said, awkwardly, "your Aunt Lillian spoke to my wife at a dinner party. She said your company's having some internal issues and that you might be stepping back." I went completely still. "She said what?" "Look, I didn't believe it," he added quickly, "but I thought you should know." I thanked him and hung up, trying to keep my breathing steady. That wasn't just petty gossip anymore. That was deliberate damage. For days after that, I couldn't shake the unease. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be another call about something Lillian had said or done. My parents tried to reassure me, but even they were starting to crumble under her manipulative guilt trips. "She's family, Eden," my mom pleaded at one point. "She's just hurt. You embarrassed her in public." "She embarrassed me for years," I said quietly, "and no one ever told her to stop." My mom didn't reply. A few weeks later, things reached a breaking point. Nathan himself showed up, unannounced, at my office. Tessa buzzed me, sounding uncertain. "Eden, there's a man here who says he's your cousin. Should I?" I told her to let him in. When he walked into my office, he looked different. Not confident, not smug, just cornered. "Eden," he said, shutting the door behind him. "We need to talk." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Go ahead." He sat down, rubbing his hands together. "Look, I didn't mean for things to get so out of control. My mom's been dramatic. You know how she gets. But you kind of humiliated me in front of everyone." I tilted my head slightly. "Did I say anything that wasn't true?" He hesitated. "No, but you didn't have to say it like that." "Like what?" I asked. "Like I finally had a voice?" He sighed. "Eden, I just need a break. A chance. Things haven't been going great for me, and your company." That's when I realized what this visit was really about. He wanted me to hire him. "You're kidding," I said, half laughing. "I'd work hard," he said quickly. "I know I said some things before, but I've matured. I just need a foot in the door." I leaned back, studying him. "You insulted my work for years. You let your mom belittle me in front of everyone. And now that things aren't going your way, you want me to fix it for you." His jaw tightened. "I'm family." I almost smiled. "Exactly. And that was when I made my decision. Quietly, firmly. I wasn't going to let them keep writing my story. But before I could do anything about it, Lillian pulled her boldest stunt yet. Something that would take this family feud to a whole new level. The betrayal hit me faster than I ever could have anticipated. I had thought I knew the depth of Lillian's entitlement, the way she tried to manipulate and undermine me over the years, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. It all started with a routine day at the office. I was going over some campaign reports when Tessa walked in, her expression unusually serious. "Eden, you need to see this," she said, holding out her tablet. On the screen was a private email thread between Nathan and one of my biggest clients. I froze. Nathan had been messaging them for weeks, pretending to be a consultant independent of my agency. He was offering insider tips on a project my company was already handling, subtly undermining my team's work. Even worse, he had copied Lillian on some of the messages, and her responses were dripping with condescension and approval. I felt the blood drain from my face. I couldn't believe it. My cousin, my own blood, was actively trying to sabotage my business, and my aunt was cheering him on. I called the client immediately, trying to contain the situation. "I just saw the emails," I said firmly. "I want to clarify that Nathan is not affiliated with my agency, and I have no idea why he's contacting you. I assure you this has no bearing on our work, and I apologize for any confusion." They were polite, but I could hear the unease in their voice. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Reputation in this industry was everything. One wrong rumor, one misstep, and it could cost years of work. After the call, I sat in my office, fists clenched, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't just petty rivalry anymore. This was an attack, and it was personal. I knew I had to confront them both, but I also knew that doing it in the heat of anger would give them the satisfaction of seeing me ruffled. I needed a plan. I started by documenting everything. Every email, every interaction Nathan had initiated, every text Lillian had sent endorsing his efforts. I wanted an unbreakable chain of evidence. As I worked, I realized just how long this had been going on. Nathan hadn't just applied for a position at my company. He'd been quietly trying to edge his way in for months, all while pretending to be the golden boy of the family. The next week, I was forced into a tense situation at a family brunch. My parents had invited me, hoping to smooth things over before Lillian could escalate further. Of course, she showed up. She had that same infuriatingly bright smile plastered on her face, acting as if nothing had happened. Nathan trailed behind her, looking far too pleased with himself. "Eden," Lillian exclaimed, pulling me into a hug that felt more like a restraining hold than affection. "It's been ages. So glad you could make it." I hugged back lightly, letting her overconfidence settle around us. "Wouldn't miss it," I said with measured politeness. Nathan waved, and I forced myself to meet his eyes without flinching. "Hey, Eden," he said casually. "Hi," I replied. The brunch started cordially enough, but the undercurrent of tension was palpable. Every other sentence from Lillian was a veiled insult. Every glance Nathan gave me was a silent challenge. And then came the moment I'd been dreading. Lillian leaned in, speaking loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. "I was just telling everyone how brave Nathan is for trying new opportunities. He really does take after his father, always looking for ways to advance and get ahead. Unlike some people who might shy away from risk." I felt my stomach twist. The barbs were obvious, and everyone at the table glanced at me. My parents shot me apologetic looks, but I stayed calm. "Funny," I said, keeping my voice light. "Nathan's been taking a few risks lately too, like undermining my company while pretending to be a consultant. Must be a family trait." The room fell silent again. Lillian's face paled, and Nathan's smug confidence faltered. And that's when it happened. The act that broke trust in a way I hadn't expected. After brunch, I returned home to find a package on my doorstep. Inside were several confidential contracts, internal memos, and client lists from my company, documents that had never left my office. I immediately recognized the handwriting of the courier. It was from someone I had trusted in my inner circle. My assistant, Tessa, had no idea how the files had been duplicated or sent out. But the implications were clear. Someone was trying to sabotage me from the inside, feeding Lillian and Nathan the exact tools they needed to attack my business. I felt the floor drop beneath me. Betrayal like this wasn't just cruel. It was personal, a violation that cut deeper than anything my aunt or cousin had said at a party. I couldn't even begin to comprehend how they'd orchestrated it. It was methodical, premeditated, and chillingly efficient. I immediately contacted my lawyer. "You need to know," I said, holding the package in trembling hands. "This isn't just harassment. It's deliberate theft and corporate espionage." My lawyer's tone was grave. "Eden, we need to act fast. This is serious. Whoever did this could be criminally liable. Do not confront them directly. Document everything. Secure all your digital and physical files, and let me handle communications with anyone who has access to the company." As I hung up, the enormity of it hit me. This wasn't just about family rivalry anymore. This was war. And the people I had trusted most, the people who were supposed to love and support me, had crossed a line I didn't even know they were capable of crossing. Over the next few days, Lillian's manipulations became even more blatant. She called my parents incessantly, spinning a narrative in which I was portrayed as paranoid and difficult, insisting that Nathan was the victim of a hostile work environment that I had created. She painted herself as the concerned mother, worried about her son's well-being, while orchestrating attacks behind the scenes. My parents were caught in the middle, and I could see the strain it caused them. My mom was heartbroken, torn between defending me and keeping the peace with her sister. My dad was furious but hesitant to confront them, wary of escalating a family feud into a full-blown disaster. And then Nathan did something so audacious, I could barely believe it. He showed up at one of our company events, not as a guest, but as a self-proclaimed consultant, using a fake badge he'd forged. He walked in, confidently inserting himself into meetings, offering unsolicited advice, and trying to take credit for work that wasn't his. I confronted him quietly in a hallway. "Get out," I said firmly. "Eden," he said with a smirk, "I'm just here to help. You don't have to be so dramatic." I stared at him, and for the first time, the calm I usually maintained cracked. "You've crossed every line imaginable. This isn't a game. Every action you take from here on out is going to be documented and reported." He laughed lightly, like I was the unreasonable one. "You're so sensitive. Mom would have a heart attack if she knew you were threatening her baby boy." That was the final straw. I realized, with a cold clarity, that Lillian had orchestrated everything. She had groomed Nathan to believe he could walk all over me, manipulate the company from within, and get away with it, all while maintaining her image as the perfect, supportive aunt. The audacity of it, the sheer premeditation, it broke something inside me. I sat in my office that night, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding, trying to process what had happened. This wasn't just family drama. This was betrayal in its purest form. Someone I had known my entire life, someone I had trusted implicitly, had decided that my success was a threat that needed to be dismantled. And the worst part? It worked. My nerves were frayed, my confidence shaken, and the stress was starting to affect every aspect of my life. I realized that from here on out, I couldn't just rely on being calm and collected. I needed a plan, a calculated, intelligent strategy to protect everything I'd built and, eventually, to ensure that Nathan and Lillian paid for what they had done. After the espionage incident with Nathan, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut and then left in a dark room to figure out how to breathe again. My company had weathered attacks before, small mistakes, minor leaks, a client threatened by a competitor, but this was different. This was personal, orchestrated by people who should have been on my side. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at the legal documents I'd compiled, the contracts Nathan had stolen, and the email trails linking him to Lillian. Everything screamed betrayal. The first week after the discovery was the hardest. I barely slept, and when I did, it was a restless haze of imagining Nathan walking around my office, pretending to be an insider, and Lillian gleefully telling my parents how concerned she was for him. I had moments of panic when I thought of the clients who might have doubted my professionalism, worried that the leak had reached further than I could control. I even considered stepping away from the company, just to escape the stress, but deep down, I knew that wouldn't solve anything. Walking away would only validate them, give them the satisfaction of thinking they'd won. I started with small protective measures. I updated security protocols, restricted file access, and installed monitoring systems to track any unusual activity. Tessa became my second pair of eyes, and I trained her to spot anything that seemed off. I also began reviewing every interaction Nathan had with our clients, mapping the timelines, and compiling evidence. The lawyer I'd contacted became a lifeline, advising me on how to handle potential sabotage without risking the company's reputation or legal standing. Emotionally, I was drained. I felt isolated in ways I hadn't before. Every time my parents tried to discuss it, it turned into a debate about family loyalty versus business integrity. My mom would sigh, her voice trembling. "Eden, I just want everyone to get along," as if my desire to protect my business and myself was some kind of overreaction. And my dad, normally my rock, seemed frustrated and helpless, muttering things like, "She's your aunt, Eden. You can't fight this." I knew he was trying to be rational, but all I felt was the sting of being utterly unsupported. Yet, amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. The very challenge that threatened to destroy me forced me to grow in ways I hadn't anticipated. I began delegating more, trusting Tessa and my senior managers with bigger responsibilities. I discovered that giving up control didn't mean losing it. It meant creating space for strategy. I learned to compartmentalize my emotions, to turn the adrenaline from fear and anger into meticulous planning. For the first time, I allowed myself to step away from the constant need to prove myself in family settings. I stopped attending unnecessary family gatherings, stopped explaining myself, and stopped justifying my success. The peace that came from ignoring Lillian and Nathan's theatrics gave me mental clarity I hadn't realized I was missing. It was as if a weight I didn't know I was carrying had been lifted. Then came the turning point, the subtle rise. One of our longtime clients, a regional retail chain, was expanding nationally and looking for a marketing partner who could manage multi-state campaigns. They approached me directly, impressed by the efficiency and creativity of our previous work. This client had been the kind that a larger firm would usually try to poach. Landing them was a major coup, not just for revenue, but for reputation. I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction, not because I could finally show anyone, but because this was proof that I had built something that could not be undermined by petty family sabotage. At the same time, I began noticing cracks in Lillian's perfect image. Word got back to me that Nathan had been confronted by a potential client who had caught wind of the forged badge and unauthorized communications. They were furious and had reported the incident to the local business association. Meanwhile, Lillian was busy trying to spin her narrative, claiming Nathan was misunderstood, but people weren't buying it. My cousin's attempts to infiltrate my company had left a trail that spoke louder than any excuse she could make. I used this to my advantage. Without broadcasting anything, I strengthened my network, reached out to new prospects, and positioned my agency as a trustworthy, resilient company, subtly contrasting the chaos Nathan and Lillian were creating elsewhere. Within weeks, new opportunities started landing on my desk. Clients who had previously been out of reach, impressed by the professionalism and stability of our operations compared to the scandals Nathan was inadvertently creating. Socially, I pulled back from toxic family interactions and focused on people who valued me for me. I reconnected with old colleagues, invested more time in my team, and cultivated professional relationships that reinforced my growth and independence. I began mentoring younger marketers, guiding them through projects and offering advice, not as a boss with ego, but as someone who had navigated failure, sabotage, and betrayal and come out stronger. Even Nathan's repeated attempts to worm his way in began to lose their power. Each email he sent, each phone call he tried to make, I treated as data points. I learned to predict his patterns, anticipate his moves, and document everything meticulously. I created a wall of sorts, both legal and operational, that kept him and Lillian from interfering directly while I quietly expanded my business. Yet, the emotional toll was undeniable. There were moments I cried alone in my office, overwhelmed by the realization that family could be so cruel and calculated. The weight of betrayal, especially from someone I had trusted implicitly, was crushing. But each tear, each sleepless night, seemed to forge something stronger within me, a resilience I hadn't recognized in myself. Months went by. The agency grew. Our client base diversified. Revenues increased, and my reputation strengthened, not because of a dramatic confrontation, but because I had refused to let sabotage dictate my life. I started investing in infrastructure, hiring additional staff, and even expanding into consulting for other agencies, carefully building an empire that could not be shaken by family antics. At home, my relationship with my parents transformed. They saw the tangible results of my efforts, and while they still struggled with Lillian's influence, they gradually began to recognize the independence and strength I had cultivated. My mom started expressing quiet pride, and my dad began offering strategic advice, no longer framing it around family loyalty, but around business acumen. I also found an unexpected ally in Ava, Nathan's fiancée. She reached out occasionally, expressing frustration with how Lillian and Nathan treated her and subtly confirming my suspicions about their manipulation. We developed a cautious, professional rapport. I never trusted her fully. She was still loyal to Nathan, but she provided insights that helped me anticipate further attempts at sabotage. Despite the rise, there was always the shadow of the family feud looming. Lillian and Nathan were still scheming, still trying to undermine me indirectly, still spreading rumors. But now, I had control, strategy, and evidence on my side. I had learned patience, restraint, and the power of preparation. I had learned to turn adversity into fuel, to let betrayal forge a stronger, smarter version of myself. Every small victory, the retention of a difficult client, a successful campaign, the thwarting of Nathan's interference, felt like a quiet, private triumph. I was no longer reacting emotionally. I was calculating, building, and rising in ways that were invisible to my aunt and cousin, but devastatingly effective. They didn't see me, and that was perfect. I knew that one day, the moment to reclaim not just my dignity, but my power over the situation would come. I didn't need to rush it. The beauty of my rise was in its quiet inevitability. Nathan and Lillian were playing checkers while I was playing chess. Each move they made only gave me more insight into their patterns, more leverage for the day when the scales would tip fully in my favor. And yet, despite the successes, the company growth, and the strategic advantage, a part of me still hurt deeply. The sting of betrayal lingered in private moments, a reminder that sometimes the people you trust most are the ones capable of the deepest treachery. That pain, however, was no longer debilitating. It had become a tool, sharpening my resolve, fueling my ambition, and reminding me exactly what was at stake. By the time the next family gathering rolled around, I was ready, not to confront them openly, but to quietly assert my power. I had grown stronger, smarter, and far less naive. The seeds of my eventual revenge were planted in these months of patient, strategic rebuilding. The rock bottom I had hit had forced me to rise higher than I ever imagined. And when the time came, Nathan and Lillian would learn just how dangerous it is to underestimate someone they tried to destroy. After months of rebuilding, documenting, and sharpening my strategy, I finally reached a place where I could stop reacting and start engineering outcomes. The thing about long, patient work is that it gives you options, tiny levers you can pull when the time is right. I'd spent those months quietly building influence, fortifying my company, and collecting everything I needed: emails, forged badge photos, client messages, courier receipts, witnesses. I wasn't reckless about it. I didn't want a messy, emotional spectacle where I looked like I'd lost my temper. I wanted something clean, undeniable, and public enough that Lillian's gossip and Nathan's petty schemes couldn't wiggle out from under it. I wanted proof, objective proof that could be shown to neutrals, people whose livelihoods depended on integrity, not family stories. The first piece of the plan was to expand my standing in the professional community. I applied to sit on the local business association's committee that handled vendor standards and professional conduct. It was bureaucratic, slow, and exactly the kind of process that favored someone who didn't need to rush. I submitted a portfolio, letters of recommendation from clients who'd weathered the Nathan nonsense and continued to work with me, and a concise statement about ethical practice in marketing. I made the point without malice, just fact. The association accepted me. Having that seat was more valuable than I'd expected. It gave me access to formal pathways for complaints and investigations, and it put me in rooms with people who valued documentation and process above anecdotes and family loyalty. While I built institutional credibility, I kept working on the human side. Ava, Nathan's fiancée, proved to be an awkward but useful ally. We never became friends, but she started to send me things, screenshots of texts she'd overheard, tangential comments Nathan made in frustration, receipts that hinted at how involved Lillian had been behind the scenes. She was caught in her own loyalty split, and I respected that. I didn't pressure her. I let her give what she felt comfortable giving. Her information helped complete small parts of the picture: dates, names, moments where Nathan had admitted he'd been coached or given talking points by his mother. Piece by piece, the mosaic formed. The technical side of the plan required patience and a little creativity. I couldn't just storm into a press conference waving documents. That would either frighten people off or be dismissed as a family feud. Instead, I framed a professional event, a panel and networking forum on marketing ethics and vendor verification that my agency co-hosted with the business association. The event sounded innocuous and beneficial on paper. Best practices for working with third-party consultants. It attracted the exact crowd I wanted: local business owners, association members, a few of our long-term clients, and importantly, people from other agencies who had no stake in any family drama. I had spent months cultivating their trust. They would listen. I planted the bait carefully. Through a mutual contact I knew would forward the invitation to the professional network Nathan frequented, I nudged an invite his way, phrased as an opportunity to present a short case study on consulting successes. His ego made him take it. He couldn't resist an audience where he could display himself as an expert. The contact who forwarded the invite did so innocently. They thought they were helping a local professional get exposure. Nathan, of course, didn't know the room would include people whose firms he'd attempted to worm into, nor that it would include the client he'd been emailing, warmly, persistently, and falsely, about projects my company was already handling. In the weeks before the event, I refined the materials I planned to present. I didn't want to look like a prosecutor. Instead, I framed the content as a neutral case study of vendor fraud and the signs businesses should watch for. Part of the presentation was an anonymized timeline of a typical infiltration: suspicious resumes, duplicate emails, forged badges, and unsolicited consultant outreach that mirrors real-world campaigns. I used redacted real emails with metadata, courier receipts, and timestamped screenshots, all things that an unbiased business audience would recognize as red flags. I also prepared a small packet for attendees, a guide to due diligence that included a checklist and examples. Those packets were practical, useful, and would land with people whose trust mattered. I scheduled my reveal for the second half of the event, after the speakers had established the context. The morning of, I felt the same tightness in my chest I'd felt the night I found the package on my doorstep, but it was different now. That tightness was purpose, not panic. I had rehearsed every line and prepped every piece of evidence. My team knew their roles. Tessa was in charge of the slides and the timing. My lawyer, who had become a steady presence through all of this, sat in the front row in plain clothes, ready if anything threatened to cross legal lines. We had non-disclosure measures in place for the documents we couldn't publish, and we built a forensic trail for anything that needed to be handed to authorities. Nothing about the event was improvised. Nathan arrived looking confident, which made me smile inwardly. He greeted people with the practiced, easy charm of someone who had always been told he was brilliant. Lillian sat with a small group at a side table, her smile bright and contained. She greeted me briefly, coldly polite, and then turned her attention back to her circle, probably smug that her golden boy was on stage to shine. I began with general stories, examples of companies I'd worked with, the harm caused by slick but empty consultants, and the emotional cost of discovering betrayal when you least expect it. I watched faces throughout the room, business owners leaning forward, association members scribbling notes, people who'd been burned before nodding in recognition. Then, when the room was already primed, I transitioned into the timeline. I spoke slowly, deliberately, narrating events with a careful, professional tone. For every claim I made, I had something to back it up. An email header showing the originating server, a courier tracking number matching a drop-off near Lillian's house, internal logs that synchronized with the timestamps Nathan had been using. I kept the family details minimal on stage. No melodrama, no petulant finger-pointing, because I knew how the room would react to sober facts. Then I showed the forged badge. I'd had it verified by a security consultant. The lamination style, badge numbering, and holographic seal were wrong. Small details that only someone who knows the system would notice. I displayed the photos side by side with authentic badges from other firms. The room murmured. A few people craned forward, suddenly very interested. Next, I played muted video clips with subtitles showing Nathan attending a competing firm's meeting with a self-made badge. He didn't look like a villain there, just someone eager and out of place. But context matters. Paired with the emails and the courier receipts, the mosaic of deception grew clear. I kept my language neutral. We believe, I said, that this was not an isolated incident, but a coordinated attempt to infiltrate operations. I clicked to the slide that showed the email trails, headers, IP addresses, and metadata. I explained in simple terms how the headers linked the messages to a device that had been used frequently near Lillian's home at specific times. I showed a redacted excerpt from an email where Nathan made a recommendation that mirrored the falsified tips he'd been peddling to my clients. And I pointed out how a client had responded, confused, because our team had already been executing that exact action plan. The room's hum turned into silence. I expected denial. Of course I did. If you've ever tried to convince someone of a betrayal inside their family, you know denial is as much a psychological defense as it is social. But what I didn't expect was how quickly the association members responded. People who depended on impartial professionalism started comparing notes. Someone in the back whispered that a similar badge had been used at another event. Another attendee, a local retailer, mentioned that someone claiming to be an independent consultant had contacted them with suspiciously detailed knowledge. The dots connected in real time, not because I forced them to connect, but because the objective evidence I'd assembled made the pattern inevitable. Halfway through the presentation, I did something I'd rehearsed and felt uneasy about, because part of me still hated the idea of directly humiliating family, but it was effective. I pulled up a brief excerpt of a voicemail recording from a client who had been confused and upset by Nathan's outreach. The client's voice was steady but incredulous, saying, "We've been working with Eden's firm for months. Someone kept emailing me pretending to be an outside consultant and claiming we hadn't briefed them. It felt like someone was trying to destabilize our partnership." That client, who didn't know anything about my personal life, was clear, calm, and genuinely concerned. The room reacted to her professional discomfort the way neutrals do, with concern and practical curiosity, not schadenfreude. That was the first public moment where the story shifted from family rumor to business risk. Then I presented the clincher, a dated email where Nathan had forwarded internal memos to an address that matched a domain Lillian had been using for her community project emails. It was a tiny, almost petty oversight on their part, but it connected the familial tie to the operational sabotage. The association's counsel leaned forward, quietly asking about evidence preservation, an institutional response that signaled we weren't just airing grievances. We were preparing a professional complaint. I watched Lillian's face as I presented these facts. For someone whose whole identity is performance, she didn't recover well. Her smile faded, then hardened. She whispered to the people at her table. Nathan, who had been brimming with confidence when he came in, looked progressively smaller. I felt neither triumph nor revenge-seeking glee. The satisfaction was quieter, like a long, necessary equation finally balanced. I had built a structure where truth could stand on its own, and I was letting it do its work. But I hadn't finished. The last part of my plan required a psychological nudge, an undeniable moment that would force choices. I arranged for two people who'd been directly affected to be in the room: the client whose project Nathan had tried to usurp, and the security consultant who'd authenticated the badge. I'd briefed them to be ready to speak if asked. When I paused and opened the floor for questions, the client raised her hand without hesitation and said, calmly, "We were contacted by someone claiming to be an external consultant, offering insights that matched our internal strategy almost word for word." When we pushed back, they became defensive and tried to sow doubt about our vendor. She looked around the room. It didn't feel like a genuine outreach. It felt engineered. A silence heavier than any I'd felt at the family table followed. Conversation rippled, practical, immediate, focused on trust and next steps. That was the point, to move the scene from emotional to operational. Once professionals started talking process, how to verify consultants, how to handle forged credentials, how to escalate complaints, the family narrative mattered less. The question in the room became, what do we do about someone who compromises the integrity of our business ecosystem? And then I did the unthinkable. At least, it felt unthinkable at the last family dinner where I'd been mocked. I turned to Nathan, who was sitting near the front, and in a voice that carried, I asked, "Do you want to speak to these points? Can you explain why you were sending unsolicited recommendations on projects we were already contracted to run, or why you showed up at a partner meeting with a badge stating you represented a firm you don't work for?" He looked like someone unprepared for the gravity of a professional forum. He stammered, this is private. It was. And then he tried to laugh it off as if charm could dissolve evidence and timestamps. But charm doesn't erase a chain of custody. The security expert politely explained what forged credentials meant in practical terms. The association counsel asked if there were more victims. Heads nodded. Phones were out. People took notes. My lawyer, who'd stayed quiet the whole event, stood up and said, simply, "We have documentation that supports these claims. If anyone here has been contacted in similar ways, please report it to the association so we can investigate formally." At that exact moment, the moment when institutional wheels started turning, the lights in the room seemed to focus differently. People who had laughed at Lillian's quips at family gatherings were now asking for forms and timelines. The tone had shifted from social judgment to procedural consequence. That was the miracle of process. It removed personal bias. The truth, packaged and verified, demanded a neutral response. But life and family rarely hands you a neat, satisfying finality at that exact second. As the murmurs and procedural talk blossomed, someone from the back of the room stood up abruptly. It wasn't one of the professionals I'd expected. It was my father. He'd come, quietly, and had been sitting there the whole time. He stood with a set expression I hadn't seen in months. The mix of a man who felt betrayed but still bound by family. He cleared his throat, so the hum of voices dipped instantly. For a heartbeat, I saw 1,000 small memories flash by. Childhood holidays, whispered bedside reassurances, the way he used to teach me to tie my shoes. The room contracted around us. "Eden," he said, and his voice was steady but raw. "I think we need to talk about this as a family." His gaze landed on Lillian and then Nathan, compassion and exhaustion twisting together. "This is serious, but it's our family." There was a plea in the last words, unvarnished and honest, and it hit me like an unexpected current. Everything changed in that split second. The professional momentum, the association's focus, even my internal script. People looked between us, unsure whether this was a courtroom or a living room. Lillian's shoulders stiffened like she'd been called out in a way she hadn't rehearsed for. Nathan's face tightened into a mask. I realized then that the revenge I'd carefully built was no longer just a public, professional dismantling of their schemes. It had also become a reckoning that cut through the layers of family obligation and memory. I had a choice in that silence. Keep pushing for the institutional process and let the professional consequences unfold publicly, or step back into the folding lines of family negotiation and risk everything unraveling into private pleas and manipulations. I had prepared for both outcomes, but nothing could fully ready me for the way my father's presence reframed the room, his plea pulling at something older than the contracts and emails. I inhaled, feeling the room hold its breath with me. My hand hovered over the next slide, the one that contained the final piece of evidence. The email with the explicit forwarding chain linking the internal memos to Lillian's email address, revealing it would accelerate the formal consequences. It would also make the situation irreversible. The moment to click was there, electric and final. And that's where I stopped. The slide remained unshown. The packet I'd printed on my lap felt heavier than paper. My father's eyes searched mine, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt the scale of what I was about to do in the presence of the people who'd shaped me. I realized the revenge I'd engineered wasn't just about exposing deceit. It was about forcing my family to see themselves in the mirror with no filters. It would change our relationships forever. It would make me the catalyst for consequences they had never imagined. It would take away their right to pretend it never happened. I didn't click the slide. Not yet. The room hummed with possibility and dread, and the final turn, the one that would tip everything, hung between my fingers like a decision that couldn't be unmade. I had planned, prepared, and executed with patience and precision. I had the power, the evidence, and the platform. But even the cleanest strategic move has a human cost, and in that suspended breath, I felt every facet of it. I looked at my father, at Lillian's hidden fury, at Nathan's shrinking posture, and at the association members waiting for direction. I felt the surge of quiet satisfaction that comes with being in control, but I also felt the weight of responsibility. The revenge I had set into motion was no longer an abstract concept. It was a force that would reshape lives. So I paused. The room leaned forward, waiting for the final click. The room held its collective breath for a heartbeat longer than it should have, and then I clicked the slide. Everything unfolded in that instant. The final piece of evidence appeared on the projector, the email chain linking Nathan directly to the internal memos, timestamps matching the exact days he had tried to insert himself into client projects, and the metadata confirming the forwarding originated from Lillian's email domain. I let it sit for a moment, allowing the professionals in the room to absorb it. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Silence had more power than any explanation. A hand went up almost immediately, one of the association council members. This is irrefutable. The chain of evidence here demonstrates deliberate sabotage, fraud, and misrepresentation of credentials, she said, voice steady but firm. We'll need to initiate a formal investigation and notify any clients or partners who could have been affected. Her words landed like a hammer. Even Nathan's feigned confidence faltered. I turned slightly toward Nathan and Lillian. Their reactions were instantaneous and visceral. Nathan's face had lost all color, replaced with a pale, tight-lipped panic. His mouth opened, then closed, a futile attempt to conjure a defense that simply did not exist. Lillian's composure cracked in a different way. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of her tablecloth, her eyes darting between me and the professionals in the room, realization slowly dawning that her carefully constructed web of manipulation was unraveling. This isn't, Nathan started, but the room cut him off with a murmured chorus of "This is serious, and we need documentation." He froze, and I could see the cognitive dissonance struggle across his features. He had spent months believing he could charm and manipulate his way through, and now the empirical proof of his actions had rendered charm useless. Lillian finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly but attempting authority. "Eden, I think this is personal. You're blowing this out of proportion." I held up a hand, calmly, measured, entirely in control. "No, Lillian, this isn't personal. This is factual, verifiable, and professional. You and Nathan attempted to manipulate business operations, compromise client trust, and gain access to confidential information. That's not opinion. That's evidence." I let each word sink in, slow and deliberate, letting them feel every syllable. The association member next to her leaned forward. "Miss Lillian, are you aware that assisting in such actions could result in formal sanctions? We take integrity seriously. Your involvement will be scrutinized." The subtle but clear legal tone hit hard. Lillian's eyes widened, the first genuine crack in her veneer of control. I paused and allowed the energy to shift further. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to curse. I didn't need to dramatize. Everything I had built, the evidence, the methodical presentation, the professional context, did the work for me. Nathan slumped in his chair, realizing his miscalculation. Lillian's attempts to command the room dissolved under the weight of impartial scrutiny. "Furthermore," I added, calmly clicking to the final slide, "the clients involved have been briefed and assured of the integrity of our company. Any further attempts to contact them outside of official channels will be treated as formal harassment, and legal measures will be enacted." I let the words linger in the room, knowing exactly how they landed. The fallout began almost immediately. The client whose projects Nathan had tried to infiltrate stepped forward, a steady presence of calm professionalism. "We've already documented our experiences," she said, "and any future contact from Mr. Nathan will be forwarded to the proper authorities." She glanced at Lillian and Nathan, her tone polite but unmistakably clear. "It is imperative that business operations are transparent. We appreciate Miss Eden bringing this to light before any damage could escalate." A ripple of acknowledgement spread across the room. Other professionals began exchanging notes and murmurs, some quietly connecting their own experiences with Nathan to the unfolding scenario. The atmosphere had shifted. This was no longer Eden versus family. This was undeniable evidence against those who had attempted deception in a professional sphere, and it was being recognized by neutral parties with authority. I felt a strange, quiet satisfaction, not the kind that comes from gloating, but the kind that comes from seeing justice unfold as a natural consequence of deliberate preparation. Every smile that Lillian tried to muster was brittle. Nathan's nervous energy filled the space like static electricity. Neither could charm, excuse, or manipulate their way out of this one. Then my father, who had been silently observing the proceedings, stood. "Eden," he said, his voice carrying over the low murmurs of the room. "I see now the truth of what's been happening. This is not just professional misconduct, it's betrayal. And I see how carefully you've handled it, balancing evidence with patience. I am proud of how you've managed this. It was subtle but transformative." My father's acknowledgement carried weight, not just emotionally, but in the eyes of the room. The professionals noted the presence of a family member who was finally confronting the reality of their private misconduct, giving further legitimacy to the process. Lillian's composure failed entirely. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the room's attention and the mounting professional scrutiny froze her words. Nathan tried again, a desperate, almost childlike attempt at charm. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." I stepped closer, calm and steady. "It wasn't supposed to go unnoticed, Nathan. But facts are facts, and evidence is evidence. You've forced a professional evaluation of your actions. I suggest you cooperate, or you will face the full consequences." My voice was quiet but unyielding, a stark contrast to the chaos that had defined our last year. By the time the meeting ended, the consequences were already manifesting. The business association formally documented Nathan's misconduct and placed restrictions on any future professional activity under his name without verification. Clients received direct communication explaining the situation, and my company's reputation not only survived the attempt at sabotage, it was reinforced by the clear, methodical handling of the incident. Nathan's attempts to usurp credibility evaporated in the face of neutral, authoritative assessment. Lillian's reactions were even more pronounced in private. I later received word from a mutual acquaintance that she had been quietly castigated by her own social circle. Friends and colleagues expressed shock at her complicity in corporate sabotage. Her carefully curated image of being a supportive, concerned aunt was shattered. Nathan, meanwhile, faced professional embarrassment that reached beyond our local community, forcing him to resign from any ongoing freelance engagements that could have conflicted with my company. The family fallout extended further. My parents had long discussions with both of them, but now the tone was clear. There would be no favoritism, no excuses, no attempts to downplay the sabotage. I had quietly built a position of authority and proof that gave me leverage not just professionally, but personally. It was a rare position where my actions were vindicated, the truth acknowledged, and the consequences unavoidable. Privately, I allowed myself to feel the full scope of relief and triumph. I hadn't just survived betrayal. I had transformed it into power. Months of meticulous planning, strategic patience, and professional diligence had produced a payoff that was clean, undeniable, and permanent. Nathan and Lillian's own actions had constructed the framework of their downfall. I had merely facilitated it, ensuring every step was documented and every move had precedent. Even better, the result wasn't just punitive, it was instructive. The professionals in the room, the clients, the association members, and even my family saw the clear lesson. Deceit, no matter how well hidden, eventually encounters consequences when met with patience, preparation, and principled action. And in that lesson lay satisfaction deeper than any personal vindication. As I left the event, my lawyer at my side, the weight I'd carried for months finally began to lift. I knew the story would ripple outward, affecting Nathan's reputation, constraining Lillian's influence, and reinforcing my own authority. I didn't need applause. The quiet acknowledgement from those whose opinions mattered most was enough. Driving home, I thought back to the family gatherings where I had been mocked, dismissed, and underestimated. Every insult, every slight, Every whispered joke about my capabilities now felt like part of a long equation, each piece contributing to the moment where justice aligned perfectly. I had not reacted in anger. I had not overextended my hand. I had acted deliberately, calmly, and with precision. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, a quiet, serene backdrop to a storm that had finally settled. I pulled into my driveway, and for the first time in months, I felt entirely at peace. The weight of betrayal, sabotage, and family manipulation no longer rested on my shoulders. The equilibrium I had fought for, professionally, personally, and morally, was restored. I opened the door and stepped inside, letting the calm sink into my bones. For the first time in a long time, I smiled without reservation. The lesson was complete. The balance had shifted. And in that quiet, powerful moment, I knew one undeniable truth. You can betray me, undermine me, and try to destroy what I've built. But if you underestimate patience, planning, and principle, you will inevitably meet the consequences you've earned. And finally, in the stillness of my own home, I allowed myself to whisper aloud, not in triumph, but in quiet affirmation, I am unshakable. The ripple of what I had done would reach far beyond this one confrontation. But in that moment, it was enough to know that justice, smart, calm, and undeniable, had been served. The storm had passed, and I was standing tall. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. I'm Gary, 27, and for as long as I can remember, my parents have had a very clear hierarchy when it came to their kids. My brother, Mark, was at the top, and I was somewhere below the dog. They didn't even try to hide it. If Mark got an A, he was a genius. If I got an A, it was, well, that's expected. You had an easier class. When Mark got into college, they threw a massive party with catering, a band, and a "Congratulations, Mark" banner that covered half the house. When I got into the same college on a partial scholarship, my mom said, we shouldn't make it a competition. That was the kind of balance my family believed in. I learned early on to stop expecting fairness. My parents liked to say I was too sensitive whenever I pointed out the double standards. Mark could blow through their money, crash their car, and still get praised for learning from mistakes. I once forgot to text my mom that I got home safely, and she told me I had no respect for the family. The thing is, I wasn't jealous, not at first. I just wanted to be acknowledged. But over the years, the favoritism went from annoying to corrosive. It wasn't just emotional anymore. It started to affect my future. After college, Mark majored in something vague, communications, or networking, as he called it, and immediately declared he was going to start his own company. My parents were ecstatic. They drained part of their retirement savings to invest in their son's vision. They even co-signed a loan for him to rent a workspace. I, on the other hand, had spent my last 2 years building a small IT service business on my own. I repaired computers, built websites for local stores, and eventually hired a couple of freelancers. I was making decent money, nothing flashy, but enough to live comfortably. My parents never once asked how it was going. If they did, it was just to say, so, still doing your little computer thing? Mark's company lasted about a year before it collapsed under debt. He spent most of his time posting motivational quotes online and calling himself a self-made entrepreneur. When it finally failed, he came home with his tail between his legs. Instead of letting him face the consequences, my parents took him back in and started rewriting the story. Suddenly, Mark was taking a break to rethink his strategy. I remember sitting across from my dad at dinner one night when he said, Gary, you should really help your brother get his business back on track. You're good with those tech things. He said it like he was asking me to lend him a pencil. I already have a business, I said, trying to stay calm. Maybe Mark should learn from what went wrong first. Mom glared at me like I had just insulted her personally. Your brother doesn't need a lecture right now. He needs support. We're family. Family. That word always came up when it benefited them. When I needed help, like the time my old car broke down and I asked if they could co-sign a small loan so I could get another, Dad told me, you're an adult now, Gary. You need to learn independence. The hypocrisy used to drive me crazy. Still, I kept my distance and focused on my work. Within 3 years, my business grew more than I ever imagined. I landed a few long-term contracts with local companies, expanded my team, and opened an office. I never bragged about it to my parents, though. I knew they wouldn't care. The last time I mentioned a new client, my mom had said, "That's nice, dear. Did you hear Mark's planning to relaunch his brand?" It got worse last year. My grandmother passed away, and the inheritance was split between my parents and their children. Or, at least, that's what was supposed to happen. I didn't find out until months later that my parents had managed my portion on my behalf. And by managed, I mean they handed it straight to Mark to help him rebuild his dream. When I confronted them, my dad said, "You don't need it right now. Mark's going through a hard time. You'll understand one day." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe how casual he was about it. I told him he had no right to take money that was legally mine. His response, "Everything we have is family money, Gary, and we decide what's best for this family." That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat there, thinking about every moment I had swallowed my pride, every time I told myself they'd treat me better if I just proved myself. I realized then that no amount of success or patience would ever make them see me as equal. For a while, I cut contact. I didn't attend family dinners or answer their messages. My mom left me voicemails about how families shouldn't hold grudges, and Mark texted me things like, "Bro, you know mom and dad love us both, right? You're overreacting." It was typical. I focused on expanding my company, bought my own home, and built the life I used to think I needed their approval for. Then, about a month ago, my mom called. Her tone was sugary sweet, the way it always was when she wanted something. "Gary, honey, we're having a big family dinner next week. Everyone's coming. Aunts, uncles, even your cousin Ben. It's been too long since we've all been together." Part of me wanted to decline, but something in her voice told me there was more to it. I said yes. I told myself it was just dinner. But deep down, I think I wanted to see them, not to reconnect, but to confirm something I already suspected, that they would never change. The dinner was at their house, the same one I grew up in. When I walked in, I noticed how nothing had changed. Same floral wallpaper, same family portraits that seemed to feature Mark a little more prominently each year. Everyone greeted me politely, but it was that awkward kind of politeness people use when they don't know what to say to someone they've gossiped about. Mark was already there, of course, smiling like a politician. He gave me a half hug and said, "Glad you could make it, bro. It's been forever." Dinner started out normally enough. Small talk, awkward laughter, the usual. But halfway through the meal, my dad cleared his throat. He stood up, holding his wine glass, and tapped it lightly. "Everyone, can I have your attention?" he said, smiling proudly. "We have an announcement." My stomach tightened. My mom reached over and grabbed Mark's hand like they were about to announce an engagement. My dad looked straight at me and said, "After a lot of thought, your mother and I have decided it's time to start planning for the future. We've worked hard for what we have, and we want to make sure it's in good hands when we retire." He paused for dramatic effect, and I already knew where this was going. "So," he continued, "we've decided to transfer ownership of the house, the savings, and the business assets to Mark. He's shown dedication and leadership, and we believe he deserves it more." The room went quiet for a split second, then erupted in applause. Actual applause. My relatives clapped while my mom teared up, looking at Mark like he'd just won a Lifetime Achievement Award. Mark gave a modest laugh and said, "I'll make you proud, Dad." I just sat there, frozen, my fork halfway to my plate. No one looked at me. No one asked how I felt. It was like I wasn't even part of the family. And yet, instead of feeling angry, I felt calm. Maybe it was because, for the first time, I wasn't surprised. I knew exactly who they were. My dad finally looked at me and said, "I hope you understand, Gary. You're doing fine on your own, and Mark's been through a lot. We need to make sure he's taken care of." I smiled, not out of kindness, but because something inside me had just clicked into place. "Of course," I said quietly. "I understand completely." What no one at that table knew was that everything they thought they owned, the house, the accounts, the assets, was no longer really theirs. And the moment the papers I'd filed last month went through, the reality of that would hit them like a brick. I kept smiling as they toasted to Mark's bright future, because I knew that by the time the next family dinner rolled around, they wouldn't be sitting in that house. And that was the last calm moment before everything changed. After that dinner, something in me shifted permanently. The calm I'd felt wasn't numbness, it was clarity. I'd finally accepted that my parents didn't see me as their son. I was just the convenient contrast that made Mark look better. But the thing about clarity is that it makes every red flag stand out sharper than ever. And in the weeks that followed, the favoritism didn't just continue. It grew louder, bolder, like they were proud of it. A few days after that dinner, Mom called me. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the better of me. "Gary," she said, in that sugary tone that always meant trouble, "your father and I were wondering if you could come by this weekend. We're doing some financial reorganizing now that Mark will be helping us manage things. We just need your signature on a few forms, nothing big." I could hear Mark's voice faintly in the background, laughing about something. My jaw clenched. "What kind of forms?" I asked. "Oh, just paperwork for the house," she said too quickly. "It's mostly a technicality. We're transferring ownership, and since you're listed on the emergency contact records, your signature is just a formality." It took everything in me not to laugh. They genuinely thought I was that naive. "I'll think about it," I said flatly and hung up. That night, I got a text from Mark. "Hey bro, don't make this weird. It's just Mom and Dad trying to get organized. You're doing great on your own. Be happy for me." Be happy for him. That line stuck with me for days. I wanted to delete the message, but I left it there as a reminder. Because behind every fake smile, every "we're family" speech, there was the same quiet expectation that I'd keep taking the hits, keep playing the quiet, responsible brother who made things easy. Over the next few weeks, I noticed how deeply they had rewritten the family story. My aunt called to congratulate me for being such a good sport. "It's so mature of you, Gary," she said, her voice syrupy and smug. "Not everyone can let their sibling take the lead like that." Take the lead? That was her way of saying get robbed politely. But it didn't stop there. My parents started acting as if Mark's so-called leadership had already changed their lives. My mom posted on Facebook about how proud she was that Mark was stepping up as the family's next generation of success. There was not a single mention of me, though she used one of my photos for her post, one I had taken when I was setting up my first office. She captioned it, "Mark helping with the new family business plans." I stared at that photo for a long time. It was mine, my space, my work. And now it was just another prop in Mark's narrative. The next time I saw them, it was because Mark invited me over to talk. Against my better judgment, I went. I told myself I wanted to hear what he had to say, but really, I think I just wanted to see how far the charade would go. He met me on the porch, smiling like a salesman. "Gary, glad you could come, man. Let's talk inside." I walked into the living room, and it felt like I'd stepped into an alternate universe. The house looked the same, but my parents' demeanor was off. Too cheerful. They offered me tea, asked about my business like they suddenly cared, and then casually mentioned that Mark had been working hard helping with their finances. "Actually," Mark cut in, "I'm planning to turn the old garage into an office space, somewhere I can build my next venture." Mom beamed. "We think it's perfect. And since you don't need the garage anymore, it's a win-win." I blinked. "What do you mean, I don't need it anymore?" "Oh, well, you used to keep your tools there, didn't you?" Dad said, waving his hand dismissively. "But now that you have that office somewhere else, Mark can make better use of it. You always said family should share resources." I wanted to say that I'd never said that, but it wouldn't have mattered. They decided what was fair long ago. Then came the part that made my blood run cold. Mark pulled out a small folder and laid it on the table. "I've been helping Mom and Dad streamline some documents," he said casually. "They asked me to make sure everything's in order for the future. You know, house title, savings, insurance. They'd feel better if you just signed off on the updates." He pushed a few pages toward me. My name was on them. They weren't updates. They were transfer agreements, documents that would have completely relinquished any legal claim I had to the house or remaining family assets. I leaned back in my chair and stared at him. "You're serious?" Mark shrugged. "It's just paperwork. I know this probably feels weird for you, but Mom and Dad trust me with this stuff now. Dad nodded in agreement, as if Mark had just explained a completely reasonable plan. It's all part of preparing for the future, Gary. We don't want confusion later. You've got your own business, your own money. This isn't about taking anything away. It's about simplifying. Simplifying. That's what they called cutting me out entirely. I slid the papers back across the table without a word. Mom frowned, clearly annoyed that I wasn't playing along. Gary, you're overthinking this. You've always been so dramatic about money. We're family. Family doesn't need to fight over things like this. I'm not fighting, I said quietly. I'm just not signing. Mark smirked, that infuriating smirk he'd been perfecting since we were kids. You always were stubborn. I stood up. And you always were entitled. Mom gasped like I'd cursed at him. Dad's face hardened. Gary, he said sternly, you're crossing a line. No, I replied, my voice calm but shaking slightly. You crossed it a long time ago. I'm just done pretending I don't see it. The silence that followed was heavy and awkward. I could tell they weren't used to me standing up to them. For years, I'd been the quiet, responsible one. The one who didn't make scenes, who just went along with their plans. But not anymore. I left before anyone could respond. Mark called after me, saying, don't make this harder than it needs to be, bro. That night, I got another message from my mom. We're very disappointed in you. Your father and I expected more maturity. Mark is trying his best, and you're making things complicated. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the text to my lawyer with a short note. They're pushing harder. Let's proceed. What my family didn't know was that, months ago, I'd quietly taken legal action to secure certain family assets that had my name on them. Assets my parents had misused when they gave my inheritance to Mark. The process had been slow, deliberate, and very quiet. My lawyer advised patience. If you let them keep digging, she'd said, they'll bury themselves. And that's exactly what they were doing. The following week, I started getting messages from relatives again. My aunt, my uncle, even a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. All telling me I should forgive my parents and not hold a grudge. Someone had clearly been feeding them a story. My mother was good at that. She could twist a situation until she looked like the victim. I learned from a mutual acquaintance that my parents had told everyone I was acting out because I was jealous of Mark's success. They said I was bitter and making things difficult out of spite. Mark, of course, leaned into it. On social media, he posted pictures of himself standing in front of the house, captioning them with things like, building the future, one step at a time. But the truth was starting to seep through the cracks. 2 weeks later, I got an unexpected call from my old neighbor, Mrs. Hernandez. She'd known my family for decades. Gary, she said gently, I thought you should know. Your parents have been talking to a realtor. They're planning to list the house soon. They said it's for retirement reasons, but something feels off. I thought you'd want to know. They were trying to sell the house. My house, technically, since part of the property still had my legal claim attached. That night, I drove by. The for sale sign hadn't gone up yet, but I saw boxes stacked in the garage and Mark's car parked in the driveway. Through the window, I could see him sitting at the kitchen table with my parents, laughing like it was the happiest night of his life. Something inside me broke then, but not the kind of breaking that leads to despair. It was the kind that clears away all hesitation, the kind that leaves only purpose. I went home, sat down at my desk, and opened the file containing all the documentation, bank transfers, inheritance records, and the signed power of attorney form my grandmother had left for me years ago, granting me partial control over her estate. The very estate my parents had mismanaged to funnel money to Mark. The next morning, I emailed my lawyer. They're trying to sell the property. Move forward with the injunction. Within 48 hours, the process was set in motion. Quiet, official, and completely out of their control. Meanwhile, my parents kept pretending everything was fine. They even invited me to another dinner to make peace. When I arrived, the tension in the air was thick enough to taste. Mom smiled too wide. Dad was oddly formal. And Mark, well, he looked smug, like someone who thought he'd already won. What they didn't know was that I'd already made sure that every account, every asset they thought they controlled, was under review. And that night, right before dessert, when my father made one last family announcement, I realized they were about to push their luck even further. He raised his glass again and said, "Your mother and I are finalizing the transfer next week. After that, everything will be official." I didn't say a word. I just smiled. The week after that dinner was brutal. I was on edge the entire time, watching my parents and Mark like a hawk. They had no idea I'd quietly strengthened my legal position. Every email I sent to my lawyer, every document I signed, every carefully timed phone call felt like building a secret fortress right under their noses. But the tension came from more than just legal maneuvering. It was the sheer betrayal of trust one was starting to see in people I thought were family. It started subtly at first. My mom called one morning, sounding unusually chipper. "Gary, darling, I was hoping you could drop by today. Mark has some exciting updates about the house. You know, planning things for the new office space." I'd been wary of going anywhere near them, but something inside me told me to keep an eye on the situation in person. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need to confront them face to face. I agreed, keeping my voice neutral. "Sure, I'll swing by this afternoon." When I arrived, Mark greeted me at the door with that infuriating half-smile. "Hey bro, perfect timing. We've been organizing things." He guided me inside, clearly trying to make everything seem normal. My parents were sitting at the dining table, looking angelic and welcoming, but I knew better. The first hour was like a carefully choreographed play. Mom fussed over me with tea, Dad pointed out progress Mark had made, and Mark himself was a perfect host, pretending to care about my business. And all the while, I felt the undercurrent of manipulation pulsing beneath their words. They wanted me to feel complicit, to feel like I had no reason to be upset. Then it happened. Mark casually mentioned something about the property taxes. "Oh, by the way, I've taken care of the taxes for the house and the garage. Don't worry about it, Gary. Mom and Dad told me it was easier if I managed everything from now on. You're busy with your business anyway." I blinked. "You took care of them?" "Without telling me." Mom chuckled nervously. "Well, it just made sense, Gary. You've got your company to run." Mark offered to help, and we said yes. I felt my jaw tighten. "Mark, these are my responsibilities too. You didn't ask me. You just assumed I wouldn't care." He waved me off, smiling. "Relax, bro. I've got it covered. You can focus on your stuff." At that point, a small seed of doubt that had been growing for months finally sprouted into anger. They weren't just ignoring me. They were actively cutting me out of my own life. And the worst part? They were all enjoying it. A few days later, I got a text from one of my cousins, someone who had always seemed neutral. It read, "Gary, I just want to warn you. Mom and Dad have been talking about your business. They're planning to redirect some of your long-term clients to Mark's consultancy. I don't know why, but they've been saying you're too small time, and it would be better for the family if Mark handled it." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was sabotage. Someone I trusted enough to consider neutral was reporting that my own parents were actively undermining my livelihood. I double-checked the client list, and sure enough, a couple of the smaller accounts I'd cultivated were suddenly listed under Mark Enterprises. My parents had tried to rewrite my professional life, just like they'd rewritten my inheritance. I confronted them that evening. I walked into their living room, my hands shaking slightly, my heart hammering. "Mom, Dad, why are you trying to take over my business? Why would you interfere with my clients?" Mom looked genuinely shocked. "Gary, that's ridiculous. We're just offering guidance. We're helping Mark develop some contacts. We're not interfering with you." Dad's tone was firm. "You're overreacting, Gary. You always do. Mark is just stepping up to help. That's all." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I don't need help. I need you to respect boundaries. You're crossing lines that have nothing to do with support." They exchanged glances. One of those silent communications that said they thought I was being ridiculous. I could almost hear their internal monologue. "He'll bend eventually. He always does." And that's when Mark leaned back, smiling, but with something in his eyes that made me freeze. "Honestly, Gary," he said, "we've been trying to protect you. You've got all this responsibility, and I just thought it would be easier if Mom and Dad handled the bigger clients for the family. Don't take it personally. Protect me? Protect me from what? From being successful? From having control over what was mine?" I stared at him, and for the first time, I saw him clearly, not as my brother, not as someone I could ever rely on, but as an accomplice in the long-running abuse and favoritism I'd endured all my life. I trusted you, I said quietly, my voice almost breaking. I trusted you weren't going to betray me like this. And you did. You all did. Mom gasped, clutching her chest as if I had struck her. Dad leaned forward, brows furrowed. Gary, calm down. That's not fair. We're trying to do what's best. What's best? I asked, my voice rising slightly. You've been taking from me my entire life and calling it love. You've prioritized him over me since the day I was born. And now, you've actually tried to hijack my livelihood. Mark shifted uncomfortably. It's not hijacking, Gary. It's guiding. You need perspective. Perspective. I snapped. Perspective is sitting down, discussing things, and respecting boundaries. Perspective is not redirecting my clients to your failing business while smiling in my face. At that moment, I realized that I couldn't reason with them anymore. I had spent years trying to earn their approval, trying to play by their rules, and all it had done was make them think it was okay to manipulate and exploit me. I understood then that the betrayal wasn't just financial. It was emotional. They had spent decades teaching me that my feelings didn't matter, that my success was invisible, that Mark's failures deserved protection while my achievements deserved dismissal. I left their house that night, my hands trembling, my mind spinning. But in the car, I felt a strange sense of liberation. If they were going to show their true colors, then I had a clear picture of what I was dealing with. They had underestimated me, assumed I'd play the long-suffering, obedient son forever. But their betrayal had lit a fire inside me. Over the next few days, I noticed the ripple effect of their actions. Some of my clients had already been misled by Mark's charm and my parents' half-truths. A small but growing portion of my revenue was at risk. And yet, with every act of sabotage, I felt my resolve strengthen. I spent hours on the phone with my lawyer, going over every document, every clause, every loophole. I wasn't just fighting to protect what was mine. I was preparing for the moment they would face the consequences of underestimating me. Then came the last straw, the day I discovered the full scope of their betrayal. My lawyer called, voice calm but firm. Gary, I need you to sit down. They've tried to remove your name entirely from the house transfer and redirect all the inheritance paperwork. They've filed forms without your knowledge and forged signatures on a few minor documents. Technically, it's fraudulent. Legally, you have a very strong case. I hung up, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of rage and disbelief. My parents had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. They had actively attempted to erase me from my own life. That night, I sat in my office, staring at the city lights through the window. I thought about every time I had swallowed my pride, every moment I had given them the benefit of the doubt. Every Christmas where Mark got the expensive gift while I got a polite nod. Every dinner where my achievements were minimized. Every time I'd been gaslit, ignored, or outright dismissed. And then I smiled, because now I had the upper hand. I had the proof. I had the legal leverage. I had the patience to see this through. And most importantly, I had clarity. Clarity about the people I'd loved, who had betrayed me at every turn, and clarity about the steps I was about to take next. By the end of that week, I knew the moment of reckoning was coming. They thought they could manipulate, control, and erase me. They didn't know I'd been quietly preparing for this for months. They didn't know that every act of favoritism, every betrayal, every condescending word had pushed me into action. After the betrayal, I hit a low I hadn't anticipated. Not low in terms of life falling apart. I had my business, my apartment, my freedom, but low in terms of trust and emotional energy. Every call from a relative, every post on social media, every casual family update from Mark felt like another layer of betrayal. I realized how much I had internalized their manipulation over the years. My confidence wavered, even though I knew intellectually that I was in the right. For the first time in years, I felt truly isolated. The first week was the hardest. I barely slept, constantly checking my lawyer's emails for updates. My mind raced with every possible scenario. What if they tried to forge even more documents? What if they found a loophole to claim my clients? What if they somehow convinced the courts that I was the one acting out? The anxiety was suffocating, but it also forced me to focus entirely on one thing: control. I couldn't control their behavior, but I could control my response. I spent that week reviewing every contract, every bank statement, every business email I had ever sent. I discovered a few minor mistakes in my bookkeeping and quickly corrected them. Things that, if Mark or my parents tried to twist, could have become ammunition against me. I tightened security on all client accounts, updated passwords, and even set up alerts to track any unusual activity. Every precaution I took felt like cementing the first brick in the wall that would protect me from them. Despite the stress, I couldn't help but notice something odd. I was finally taking care of myself. I started exercising again, running early in the mornings, not just to burn off stress, but to feel strong and grounded. I stopped eating out of distraction or anxiety and began cooking meals that made me feel healthy and energized. The small victories of self-care became a foundation for mental clarity. It was almost meditative, like reclaiming pieces of myself I'd long ignored while trying to navigate their favoritism and manipulation. By the end of that month, I was still tense and angry, but I was sharper than ever. My business, which had been quietly expanding, began to flourish in ways I hadn't anticipated. Clients responded positively to my renewed energy and focus. I even landed a couple of significant contracts with companies I'd previously only dreamed of working with. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family was busy plotting against me, I was quietly building an empire of my own, entirely independent of their support. It was during this period that I realized the value of walking away, not leaving out of fear, but leaving with purpose. I stopped engaging with my parents' calls and texts. I ignored Mark's occasional attempts to check in under the guise of brotherly concern. Each time I resisted the urge to respond, I felt my emotional armor strengthen. I wasn't just surviving. I was learning how to operate outside the toxic gravity of my family. Then came the first hint that my plans were working. One evening, I got a call from a client I'd taken on 2 years earlier. "Gary," he said, voice hesitant but warm, "I've been hearing some things from other people. I want to make sure you're still handling our account. Honestly, your professionalism has made us rethink our contracts with some of our consultants." It hit me that my reputation, built quietly and meticulously, was now bulletproof against my family's manipulations. Their attempts to undermine me had, unintentionally, highlighted how competent and reliable I was. My business wasn't just surviving. It was thriving despite the chaos they'd tried to inject. As my professional life soared, my personal boundaries became unshakable. Friends I'd neglected over the years received more attention. I reconnected with people who actually valued me, who didn't have hidden agendas. I realized that I had been so conditioned to seek validation from my parents and Mark that I hadn't even noticed the support system I had built outside of them. That network became a lifeline, emotionally and professionally. But the most significant change wasn't external, it was internal. I began to see my parents and Mark not as authority figures who controlled my life, but as flawed humans whose decisions no longer dictated my path. The anger that had consumed me initially transformed into clarity and strategic patience. I no longer wasted energy on expecting apologies or recognition. Instead, I focused entirely on my ascent, quietly, deliberately, like a chess player several moves ahead. The culmination of this period came when I received the official notice from my lawyer. All attempts by my parents and Mark to transfer or manipulate assets had been blocked. Every account, every piece of property, every document they tried to claim fraudulently was now fully under my legal control. The sense of relief was overwhelming, but so was the satisfaction. I hadn't had to confront them directly or escalate publicly. The law, combined with careful preparation, had done the heavy lifting. Still, I didn't celebrate. Not yet. There was no need for dramatic flair. The power I had gained was quiet, almost invisible to the outside world. And that invisibility was key. My parents and Mark still thought they were in control, still assumed I was playing their game. That ignorance was a weapon I intended to keep sharp. During this time, I also began thinking about leverage beyond the legal documents. I started tracking every move Mark made in his failing ventures, every boastful social media post, and every casual remark my parents made to extended family. Each piece of information was potential evidence, proof that they were not just careless, but negligent, manipulative, and entitled. I wasn't planning on revenge for revenge's sake. I was planning for inevitability. When the moment came, everything would align perfectly, and their facade of perfection would crumble under the weight of their own decisions. Meanwhile, Mark remained blissfully unaware. He called a couple of times, dropping hints about expanding his ventures, growing the brand, and taking the family forward. I responded politely, but minimally, careful not to give anything away. Inside, I felt a quiet amusement. The arrogance with which he had treated me, assuming I would never challenge him, was staggering, and that arrogance would be his undoing. The final piece of my rise was emotional. I began journaling again, not for my parents, not for Mark, but for me. Every slight, every betrayal, every moment of favoritism was recorded and analyzed. This process transformed anger into strategy. I understood patterns, motives, weaknesses, and opportunities. The same people who had tried to erase me from my life had, unknowingly, mapped out their vulnerabilities in full detail. By the end of the third month after the betrayal, I was unrecognizable, not to myself, but to them. I was no longer the eager, quiet son hoping for acknowledgement. I was calculated, independent, and quietly powerful. My business was thriving, my personal life was flourishing, and every attempt they had made to control me had backfired spectacularly. And yet, I waited, patiently, because real power isn't just about recovery or success, it's about timing. You strike when the other side believes they are untouchable, and my family, arrogant and entitled, thought they had already won. That tension built over weeks, then months. I watched as my parents began to flaunt Mark's success at family gatherings, how they assumed I was still irrelevant. I heard the whispers from extended family, the casual remarks about how mature Gary is for letting Mark handle things. Every comment, every smug smile, every misplaced compliment added fuel to the fire. And all the while, I was readying the pieces on my board. My legal power was secure. My business was untouchable. My credibility was unassailable. All I needed was the right moment. One misstep, one overreach, one public display of entitlement, and their carefully constructed world would start to collapse. The real beauty of it was that I didn't have to force it. I didn't need to confront them directly. I didn't need to create drama. I simply had to remain patient, watch them unravel themselves, and be there to act when they finally showed their true colors. I remember sitting in my office one night, reviewing Mark's social media updates and my parents' emails to extended family, and I realized I had everything I needed. They were walking right into the trap. Every boast, every manipulation, every assumption of control. They were building the very foundation I would use to expose them. For the first time in my life, I felt untouchable, not because I was invincible, but because I had finally stopped letting their entitlement define me. I had hit rock bottom emotionally, but in that rock bottom, I found clarity, strength, and an unshakable sense of purpose. And that's when I started to think about the final moves, the ones that would force them to face consequences for every slight, every betrayal, every moment they had tried to erase me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was strategic. And when the day came, it would not be messy. It would be precise, inevitable, and devastating. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the city lights, and for the first time in years, I smiled freely. Because the rise had begun. After months of quiet preparation, the plan came together in a way that felt almost anticlimactic. Not because it wasn't dramatic, but because I'd learned to value precision over theatrics. Revenge, I decided, would not be a messy tantrum or a viral smear campaign. It would be legal, immovable, and so elegantly boring that no one would suspect it until it had already happened. In the months leading up to the move, I did three things consistently. I fortified every professional relationship I had. I documented every lie and financial misstep my parents and Mark had committed, and I positioned myself in places of legitimate authority that would let me act without tipping my hand. Those months were the real work. Hours of combing bank statements, transcribing phone calls, saving emails, and quietly resecuring every contract that could be redirected. I kept a spreadsheet with dates and receipts that looked dry on paper, but, together, formed a chain that would make the entire house of cards collapse once the right legal gears were turned. The first concrete gain was subtle. I used the partial authority my grandmother's documents had granted me, not to seize anything immediately, but to audit. That audit revealed an array of small but damning irregularities. There were unexplained withdrawals from the account labeled Family Preservation Fund, transfers to accounts that tied back to shell entities Mark claimed to use for brand building, and a stack of bills for property improvements that never occurred. A few of those transfers had been made after my grandmother's death and were either poorly documented or supported by my parents' vague, handwritten notes. Those notes were the kind of casual paper trail people consider harmless. To a lawyer, they were the equivalent of a confession. My lawyer's eyes lit up when I showed her the ledger. "This is sloppy enough to pursue criminally," she said. "We can force discovery, and once we do, there will be no hiding." That was the first leverage I didn't have before. Parallel to the financial side, I reclaimed my professional life with surgical moves. I personally reached out to every client who had been approached by Mark or who'd been given advice by my parents. I didn't call to accuse them of anything. I called to thank them, to clarify the scope of my contracts, and to remind them of the deliverables I'd been providing for years. The tone was warm and matter-of-fact, no drama, no guilt trips. In nearly every conversation, the response was the same: confusion, apologies, and a reluctant agreement to keep working with me. A few contracts that had been threatened were renewed, some with better terms than before. Clients told me, more than once, that Mark's pitch sounded hollow in person. That validation mattered more than I expected. It turned nervous prospects into anchors and gave me the cultural capital I needed to survive any social fallout. On the legal front, we filed a quiet but strategic slate of motions. The first was a temporary restraining order against any transfer of assets tied to the estate and the house. The second was a formal complaint alleging forgery and financial exploitation of a deceased person. Those filings weren't designed to humiliate. They were designed to freeze everything in place. When the court clerk signed the injunction, it felt like closing a gate behind which my family could no longer run wild. The injunction didn't just stop the sale. It required my parents and Mark to turn over bank records and all contracts involving estate assets. They were forced, by law, to expose the paperwork they'd been so casual about. That's when the real unraveling began. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly their social armor would melt under the simplest legal obligation: honesty. Suddenly, passing a notary or explaining a withdrawal in front of a person who asked direct questions became a minefield. My parents, who had been so comfortable telling stories that made them look noble, found themselves unable to produce receipts, invoices, or plausible explanations. Mark's brand partners were, in several cases, small businesses with no business history beyond a PayPal account. The bank freezes meant payroll issues for some of the consultants Mark had relied on, and that led to phone calls from people who no longer sounded supportive. My cousin Ben, who had once clapped the loudest at that dinner, started asking awkward questions in group chats. "Do you guys have the paperwork for that donation?" He sent private messages I hadn't expected. "Are you okay? This looks bad." My parents responded to him with the practiced performance of the injured, the one they'd used on me for years, but it didn't convince anyone with an inbox full of subpoenas. The real kicker was what happened when the bank compliance officer called my lawyer directly. They discovered that some of the accounts Mark and my parents had tried to present as family-run were nominally tied to corporate credit lines that had been taken out in the parents' names but used to finance Mark's lifestyle. Those lines had missed payments. When a bank flags an account for suspicious activity, it triggers reviews, potential liens, and, in some cases, calls for repayment. That was a legal mechanism I'd waited for like a predator waits for tide changes. The debt Mark's family had quietly amassed began to show up on paper, and on paper, The story looked a lot different than the one they told relatives over Sunday roast. The combination of the injunction and the bank's compliance review meant that assets were frozen and liabilities suddenly had to be accounted for publicly. At the same time, I walked a quieter path to power. I negotiated with the trustee of my grandmother's remaining portfolio to appoint an independent auditor and a temporary receiver. The receiver's role was simple and devastatingly effective. Manage the estate impartially while the court sorted the allegations of fraud and mismanagement. Once in place, the receiver had the authority to terminate contracts made in bad faith, to reverse unauthorized transfers, and to demand immediate accounting. The receiver's reports made for bulletproof material in court and, when shared with a few family members, changed the tone of the family gatherings overnight. People who had been ready to applaud Mark were now whispering in corners. That whisper was everything. It pulled cousins out of the chorus line of applause and replaced it with the unsettling sound of skepticism. Revenge, if you could call it that at this point, wasn't about inflicting pain for its own sake. It was about restoring reality. So when the time came to execute the move that would make the consequences undeniable, I did it with the same calm I'd used to fortify everything else. I organized a family meeting of sorts under the guise of mediation. My lawyer and the receiver agreed that before we went to court, it would be better to show the family what the evidence looked like. Sometimes a sober presentation in a neutral room brings a confession or a settlement faster than a courtroom battle. I invited my parents and Mark to a meeting at the mediator's office. I didn't tell them the mediator would be present. I told them I hoped we could talk things through. Their overconfidence made them arrive early, smug, and polite, thinking they had nothing to hide. The mediator's conference room was deliberately sterile, glass walls, a big table, and chairs that encouraged formality. I sat with a folder of exhibits, but I let my lawyer lead the conversation. For an hour, I listened to my parents explain away transfers and to Mark insist his brand was legitimate. Then the mediator, politely, asked for documentation. My parents produced notebooks. Mark produced a stack of glossy printouts that were mostly social media screenshots and friendly invoices. My lawyer asked for bank statements, contracts, notary receipts, anything tying those invoices to real work. That's when the cracks widened. Dad's face twitched when asked to account for a large transfer that appeared to have been funneled to a company with no registered address. Mom fumbled, claiming she must have misfiled something. Mark's voice, so used to a rehearsed bravado, went flat. The mediator excused us, and my lawyer did what she'd planned. She handed them a draft of the receiver's preliminary report. It was clinical, detached, and merciless. It listed the transfers, showed the gaps, and quoted statutes about financial exploitation of an estate and forgery. It referenced communications where my parents had discussed making things simpler by cutting me out. Reading it out loud in that room, calm, factual, broadcast into the corners of the building through a recorded mediation, made the air go cold. There was no need for accusations framed as anger. The law did it for me, in dense paragraphs and numbered exhibits that left little room for spin. What followed was predictable and brutal. My parents tried denial, then deflection, then tears. Mark shifted from anger to pleading to brittle rationalizations. But the receiver's authority meant immediate consequences. The bank flagged the house's title as subject to litigation. A few of Mark's key vendors were put on notice they could not be paid without court permission, and my parents' access to joint accounts was suspended pending a full audit. The mediator's office wouldn't serve as a public square, but the message went out. These were no longer private family squabbles. They were legal matters with enforceable remedies. The family who had applauded at that dinner was no longer applauding. There were phone calls, whispered conversations, and the slow, horrified realization that the party line, "It's all for Mark, he deserves it," had turned into a legal liability that put their lifestyle at risk. I'd expected anger, perhaps tears, certainly some dramatic pleas for mercy. What I didn't expect was the way the community around them began to shift. A neighbor who once complimented their garden called to ask if they'd be able to maintain the loan payments. And a longtime family friend who once volunteered to co-sign for Mark's business quietly offered to meet with the receiver to clarify any misunderstandings. Patriotic-sounding testimonials evaporated when confronted with subpoenas and audit reports. When people realized money and reputation were on the line, their applause turned into distance. And then, the day the receivers served the notice placing the house under temporary receivership, my mother finally lost her composure in a way she never had with me. She yelled in the hallway of the mediator's building, not at me, not at Mark, but at the universe for conspiring to reveal what she'd worked so hard to cloak in stories. "You'll ruin us," she shouted, voice cracking. "You'll throw us out on the street." Her hands trembled. Dad was quiet, staring at his shoes like a man who had just realized the one rule he thought eternal, family first, had become the instrument of his downfall. I could have delivered the final blow there, in that lukewarm conference room, by publicly displaying every document, by running to whichever relative would listen and telling the whole sordid truth. But I didn't. I believed then, as I do now, that the most satisfying victories are those that force your opponent to expose themselves. Instead, I let the legal mechanisms do the work. The receiver's notice did something more potent than humiliation. It introduced a new reality. The bank could call the loan. Property taxes could go unpaid. Vendors could demand payment. The paperwork I'd compiled ensured that the system would begin moving, sober, impartial, and unstoppable, toward consequences. That evening, alone in my apartment, I watched the notifications roll in. A respected client confirmed their renewal with an improved rate. My lawyer sent a curt note that the initial hearing had been scheduled. An anonymous family member texted, "I'm so sorry. We had no idea." And my hands, which had trembled in the early months, were steady as I typed a simple reply to my lawyer, "Proceed." I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate with fireworks. I made coffee, reviewed the exhibits one more time, and wrote a list of questions for the hearing. Business as usual. Efficiency. Control. But beneath that calm, a quiet satisfaction bloomed. In the weeks that followed, paperwork turned into action. Lenders asked uncomfortable questions. Some of Mark's partners sought to distance themselves. The house was frozen. Life shifted from complacent certainty to bureaucratic limbo. And slowly, like cracks forming in ice, the family's bravado dissolved into frantic attempts to negotiate, to barter, to find safety under rules that no longer protected them. I knew this was only part of the plan, the setup that would expose them and the first legal blows that would change their day-to-day reality. The rest, the moment where everything became public and irreversible, was still ahead. I had secured leverage, allies, and evidence. I'd reclaimed clients and cleaned my business of ghosts. Now I had to choose when and how to press forward so that the consequences would be complete and undeniable. There was one more right move remaining, one precise action that would turn legal chaos into personal consequence, one that would make them truly understand what it felt like to be erased. I slept that night with the receiver's notice on my mind and a strange, heavy sense of responsibility in my chest. Revenge had begun to look less like vengeance and more like correction. I had not wanted to leave them homeless. I had wanted to ensure that the people who'd profited from deceit and favoritism were no longer permitted to hide behind a bedtime story of family duty. Still, as the next hearing drew nearer, I realized that law could only do so much. There was a human moment coming, one where the family would confront the fallout in person. I prepared for that meeting the same way I had prepared my case, meticulously, unemotionally, and with everything in its place. And then, just as the hearing notice landed in my inbox and the receiver prepared the public accounting that would be mailed to every family member, something happened that none of my spreadsheets had predicted. A call came to my lawyer's office from someone entirely unexpected, someone who could change the tone of the hearing, who had influence over one critical creditor, and who knew details that were not in any bank statement. The voice on the other end introduced herself and said, quietly, "I know what you've done. I also know what they tried to hide. Meet me before the hearing. There's more." I felt my pulse quicken in a way it hadn't in months. The pieces were in motion, but there were still doors I hadn't opened, and apparently, an ally I hadn't yet considered. The next step, whatever it would be decisive. I closed my laptop, poured a cup of coffee, and sat with the knowledge that this was not the end. It was the hinge, the moment of true reckoning, the one that would make the consequences not just legal but personal, was approaching. I could feel the weight of it, and I understood now more than ever that when it came, I needed to be as implacable as the law I'd used to protect myself. The hearing felt surreal, less a clash of personalities and more a slow-motion unmasking. The courtroom wasn't filled with the drama I'd imagined when I was younger and angry. Instead, it was bureaucratic, clinical, and terrifying in its precision. My parents sat on the same bench where they'd once scolded me for being too dramatic, but this time the dramatic part was gone. There were papers, sworn statements, copies of transfers with dates and times, emails I'd printed that showed Mark bragging about making things simple, and my mother's hand-scrawled note. Pay Mark, keep everyone calm. The judge read through the receiver's report in a voice that made it clear the court was not interested in family narratives, only facts. When the clerk called out line items and the auditor confirmed missing invoices and forged signatures, I watched my father's shoulders slump in a way they never had when I got upset for something smaller and personal. My mother's eyes were red, but not from curtains of tears. They were from the slow, heatless realization that the version of herself she'd been performing for decades couldn't survive under oath. Mark tried to make an argument about intention, that he'd been only trying to help, that the transfers were for business development, that none of it was criminal. But a hand at the back of the courtroom had already flipped through the bank's compliance report and the trustee's ledger. The line between sloppy accounting and criminal behavior had, in several places, been crossed. My lawyer asked to submit evidence showing that transfers occurred after my grandmother's death and without my consent. The judge, after a careful pause, said something I'll never forget. The law protects the vulnerable, and while this is a family, it does not confer immunity from the rules that bind everyone else. It was a polite, implacable version of what I'd been saying for years with louder language. Only now it came with a gavel. Consequences arrived in increments, each one small enough to be believable, but together forming a wave that carried them away from the comfortable life they'd assumed was protected by family sentiment. The bank moved to place liens on accounts that had been misused. Creditors who had previously accepted Mark's paper invoices demanded proof of service. The receiver issued notices that certain transfers would be reversed where possible and that disputed funds would be held pending further investigation. More painfully, for them, the community began to shift. The lawn care contractor who had once given my dad a discount called to say they would no longer extend credit. The local club where my parents had socialized quietly canceled their membership pending resolution of outstanding fees. People who had once cheerfully clapped at their dinner table announcements now returned calls with the kind of cautious, distance-keeping language people use when they are quietly reassessing the risk of association. Mark's facade crumbled first. Without access to the accounts and with vendors pulling back, his brand became an empty set of promises. One by one, the people he'd called partners stopped returning his calls. A consultant who'd once taken a paycheck from an account later told the receiver they'd performed little or no work. When the creditors began sending letters demanding repayment, Mark first tried to charm his way out of it, then attempted stern threats, and finally, when those failed, he panicked. I won't pretend I felt triumph then. I felt cold, focused relief. I'd watched him shrug off responsibility his entire life. It was almost poetic to see him confronted by consequences he didn't understand how to navigate. He called my parents with a new tone, a pleading edge to his voice, asking them to help the way they'd always helped before. They had nothing to give. My parents' social capital dissolved slowly into a sequence of humiliations. For the first time, they faced contractors asking for overdue invoices, neighbors who refused small favors, and relatives who stopped showing up to family events for fear of being dragged into testimony or subpoenas. My mother tried the old strategy, publicly perform the injured party and rally the cousins. But that trick had lost its magic now that there were paper trails and sworn statements. A few cousins who'd applauded at that fateful dinner issued halting apologies once they'd seen the documents. Others simply withdrew, unwilling to risk their own reputations. I received several messages from relatives that could best be described as sheepish and practical. Who was the lawyer? What would be needed for settlements? Were there alternative arrangements for mortgages? Behind those questions was a quiet recalibration, people deciding which side to be on based on facts rather than feelings. In the weeks after the hearing, the practical consequences accelerated. The receiver negotiated terms to stabilize certain essential bills. Property taxes needed to be current to avoid liens that would make the house effectively unsellable. Some of Mark's personal creditors sought wage garnishments and presented evidence of personal expenditures billed to the family brand. When the receiver issued an interim accounting to all interested parties, it included an addendum, a recommendation that the estate be managed conservatively, potentially selling non-essential assets to cover liabilities. That recommendation was the first time the word sell moved from the realm of rumor into the realm of action. There would be estate auctions, forced repayments, and for a family that had always assumed the house and savings were an eternal safety net, the idea that those things could be liquidated was a seismic shock. Public humiliation accompanied practical loss in ways that were almost worse. A Sunday visitation where neighbors used to bring casserole dishes dissolved into a parade of awkward small talk. My mother, who once hosted coffee mornings, found the invitations drying up. At the club where my father loved to play cards, the regulars gave him polite nods, but no long conversations. The image they had sold to the world, that of a respectable, well-off family preparing to pass on a legacy, became a story about financial mismanagement and poor judgment. My parents were forced into a shrinking social circle that accepted no excuses. They tried to blame lawyers, the system, or even me. None of those reasons held up under the light of contractual dates, bank stamps, and the honest confusion of vendors who'd been unpaid. Mark's dissent flattened him into something pitiful. He started leaving voicemails where the bravado cracked. He drove past my office one afternoon, then parked on the next block and watched me leave, as if trying to figure out whether I'd moved on to a life he couldn't touch. At one point, in a moment of desperate bargaining, he tried to meet me in person to ask if I would help him sort things out, suggesting he'd learned lessons and wanted to rebuild as part of the family. I met him at the edge of the park, in public, because my life no longer provided him the private confessions to manipulate. He talked fast, words tumbling into apologies and promises. I listened. When he finished, I told him simply that whatever he rebuilt would have to be built honestly, and that I would not take part in propping up a house of cards. He asked if I hated him. I said I didn't hate him. I pitted the fact that he had never been made to be responsible. He left with his head low, which felt like a victory of sorts, but not the kind I'd imagined when my anger first burned. The most wrenching part wasn't the money. It was what money represented. The stories, the performances, the lies that had been a family's rhythm for decades. When the house went into receivership, it was not a single event, but a catalog of gradual possessions. Car payments called due, service contracts frozen, an eviction notice on a rental Mark kept that, when challenged, forced him to move out of the small apartment where he'd been staying. The big, showy loss was the house itself. When the receiver announced the need to market non-essential properties to cover liabilities, I watched my parents' faces when agents inspected the place and walked through rooms that had once been theater for their performance. They stood at the back of the house while strangers measured and evaluated. That was a private cruelty, watching the stage where they'd acted as gracious providers turn into an asset to be appraised by people who had no interest in their family myth. A few relatives tried to make amends. Some offered to help them find work or counsel. Others sent money quietly to cover immediate needs. My mother received a letter from an old friend offering a temporary room. My father, stubborn as ever, refused to let anyone handle his independence, but eventually accepted a day job at the local hardware store stocking shelves, an ironic return to the humble starting points he'd once admonished me for. There was no dramatic reconciliation. Instead, small acts of practical help replaced performative support. My parents were, in unclothed form, people who had to adapt to new boundaries they'd never anticipated. For me, The aftermath offered a strange, layered closure. I had not sought vengeance as an end in itself. I wanted a restoration of integrity and to stop being quietly exploited. The legal process had ensured accountability without needing me to enact humiliations personally. People who had once applauded were forced to reckon with what their applause had enabled. I had interviews with the receiver, with the auditors, and I testified truthfully and plainly. No melodrama, no revenge theater, just facts. Friends who had been distant watched from afar, some sympathetic, some nervous. New professional opportunities continued to find me, perhaps because people preferred partnering with someone who demonstrated steadiness under pressure. I grew into a different kind of man during that time, less the boy who swallowed his hurt and more a person who set boundaries and enforced them. There were moments of unexpected kindness too. A vendor who had been stiff during the early days of the injunction later handed me a small package on my doorstep, a set of old tools my grandfather had used. For continuity, he said quietly. That gesture landed harder than any public vindication because it was private, sincere, and not contingent on my parents' approval. It reminded me that while families fracture, community can knit itself in other ways. It reminded me I wasn't alone. Months after the mess began, the estate's affairs were still being sorted, but the worst of the immediate storms had passed. The house was listed under the receiver's authority and eventually sold to satisfy debts that had been tied to Mark's life choices and my parents' poor stewardship. I watched from a distance as movers carried boxes out the front door. People I'd known my whole life waved awkwardly, as if to say goodbye to ghosts and hello to new quiet neighbors. My parents' names were on a public record that now included defaults and judgments, things you can't scrub with an edited Facebook post or a tearful call to a cousin. For once, there was no applause echoing through a family room. There was only the low hum of consequences. In the calm that followed, I made choices that felt like recovery rather than retaliation. I expanded my business into new markets, yes, but I also invested time in relationships I'd neglected. I reconnected with friends who'd been steady, and I learned to recognize the subtle signs of people who wanted reciprocity rather than leverage. My parents, for their part, retreated into a quieter life that, in some ways, suited them. They were forced to live without the illusion of entitlement, and, for reasons I can't explain, that stripped away some of their ability to perform indignation. Mark moved away, took small jobs, and for the first time was accountable for his rent and his bills. He messaged me once a year on my birthday with a short note. No pleading, no assumptions, just, "Happy birthday." I responded with a simple thank you and nothing more. There were people who thought I had gone too far. Some said I should have forgiven, should have made phone calls instead of filings, should have understood the pressure my parents felt. Those voices existed, and I listened, but I also knew the cost of staying silent. I'd given and given and given until there was nothing left for me. Doing nothing would have been an endorsement. The law had allowed me to level a playing field that had never been level to begin with. It had given me the right to insist on fairness. On the last day I saw the house, months after the sale closed and after the final accounting was posted publicly, I walked across the street and stood with my hands in my pockets while a moving truck idled in the driveway. The new owners were laughing softly as they talked about renovations. A child tugged at their sleeve and pointed to the oak tree in the front yard. The scene was ordinary, and ordinary was the goal. Life continued for other people and would, eventually, for my family too. I felt no gloating joy, only a quieter, steadier thing that had been hard-won. The knowledge that I had chosen myself when no one else would, and that the world had responded in kind. As I left, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "We're sorry for everything. We're trying to learn." I read it twice, felt the old ache, and then set the phone aside. Some apologies are the beginning of repair. Others are the formalities people write when their options narrow. I had already decided how I would respond, and it did not involve reopening rooms that had been bricked up for good reasons. I had reclaimed what was mine, not to punish them forever, but to stop the cycle. Years later, at a small family gathering where my parents sat quietly at a table near the wall, someone toasted me. An uncle who'd watched the mess unfold and respected the restraint with which I'd handled everything. He raised his glass and said, "To Gary, for doing what had to be done." I looked at my parents as they stared at their drinks. I looked at Mark, who caught my eye for a fraction of a second and then looked away. I raised my glass and clinked it gently against mine, not with the need for their approval, but with the satisfaction of someone who had finally written the last line of a story that had been going on too long. When I set my glass down, the room felt quieter, clearer. I left the gathering early and walked home alone, not because I wanted solitude, but because, for the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone to tell me who I was. The finality of the months before had taught me something small and absolute. You can be hurt by people you love, and you can still choose to be better than the hurt. And in that choice, steady, unglamorous, irrevocable, there was a kind of peace I had never been allowed to inherit. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.